V.I. Lenin. Conspectus of Lassalle's book, The Philosophy of Heraclitus, the Obscure of Ephesus. Footnote. Conspectus of Lassalle's book, The Philosophy of Heraclitus, the Obscure of Ephesus, Berlin, 1858, is contained in a notebook following the note on Lipp's book, Natural Science and World Outlook. Following the conspectus of Lassalle's book, there is a fragment in the notebook entitled On Dialectics. End of footnote. Written 1915, first published in 1930 in Lenin Miscellany, Volume 12. F. Lassalle, The Philosophy of Heraclitus, the Obscure of Ephesus, 2 volumes. Berlin, 1858, pages 379 plus 479. Bern, log 119, 1. In the epigraph inter alia from Hegel from his History of Philosophy, that there is not a single proposition of Heraclitus that he would not have adopted in his logic. In parentheses, Hegel, Collected Works, Volume 13, page 328. My quotation from Vorlesungen über die Geschichte der Philosophie. Editor's note. Reference is being made to the conspectus of Hegel's work, Lectures on the History of Philosophy, in which Lenin makes his quotation. See page 259 of this volume. End of editor's note. One can understand why Marx called this work of Lassalle's quote-unquote schoolboyish. See the letter to Engels. Footnote. Lenin is referring to a letter from Marx to Engels dated February 1st, 1848. See Marx and Engels, Selected Correspondence, Moscow, 1955, pages 121 to 123. End of footnote. Lassalle simply repeats Hegel, copies from him, re-echoing him a million times with regard to isolated passages from Heraclitus, furnishing his opus with an incredible heap of learned ultra-pedantic ballast. The difference with respect to Marx, in Marx there is a mass of new material, and what interests him is only the movement forward from Hegel and Feuerbach, further from idealistic to materialistic dialectics. In Lassalle there is a rehash of Hegel on the particular theme selected, essentially transcribing from Hegel with respect to quotations from Heraclitus and about Heraclitus. Lassalle divided his work into 2 parts. General part, Introduction, Volume 1, pages 1 to 68, and historical part, Fragments and Evidence, the remainder. Chapter 3 in the general part, quote, Short logical development of the system of Heraclitus, pages 45 to 68, gives the quintessence of the method of Lassalle's conclusions. This chapter is sheer plagiarism, slavish repetition of Hegel concerning Heraclitus. Here too, and still more in the historical part, there is a mass of erudition, but it is erudition of the lowest kind. The exercise set was to seek out the Hegelian element in Heraclitus. The Strebsamer, editor's note, industrious, end of editor's note, pupil performs it brilliantly, reading through everything about Heraclitus in all the ancient and modern authors, and putting a Hegelian construction on everything. Marx, in 1844-47, went from Hegel to Feuerbach, and further beyond Feuerbach, to historical and dialectical materialism. Lassalle, in 1846, began, in parentheses, preface, page 3, in 1855 resumed, and in August 1857, in parentheses, preface, page 15, finished a work of sheer, empty, useless, quote-unquote learned, rehashing of Hegelianism. Some chapters of the second part are interesting, and not without use, solely for the translations of fragments from Heraclitus, and for the popularization of Hegel, but that does not do away with all the above-mentioned defects. The philosophy of the ancients and of Heraclitus is often quite delightful in its childish naivete. For example, page 162, how is it to be explained that the urine of persons who have eaten garlic smells of garlic. And the answer, quote, "Is it not that, as some of the followers of Heraclitus say, one and the same fiery process of transformation takes place both in the universe and in organic bodies, and then after cooling appears there in the universe as moisture, and here takes the form of urine, but the transformation of evaporation from the food causes the smell of that from which it has arisen by mixing with it." Unquote. Pages 162, 163. On page 221 et seq., Lassalle quotes from Plutarch, who says with regard to Heraclitus, quote, "In the same way as everything is created by transformation out of fire, so also fire out of everything, just as we obtain things for gold, and gold for things." Unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, Heraclitus on gold and commodities. In this connection, Lassalle writes about value, in parentheses, vert, page 223, nota bene, and about Funktion des Gelds, editor's note, function of money, end of editor's note, expounding it in the Hegelian manner as, quote, "separated abstract unity," unquote, and adding, quote, "that this unity, money, is not something actual, but something merely ideal, is evident from the fact," unquote, etc. But all the same, nota bene, that this was written in a book that appeared in 1858, the preface being dated August 1857. In note 3 on page 224, in parentheses, pages 224 to 225, Lassalle speaks in still greater detail about money, saying that Heraclitus was no quote-unquote political economist, that money is, in double parentheses, only, a Wertzeichen, editor's note, token of value, end of editor's note, etc., etc. Quote, "All money is merely the ideal unity or expression of value of all real products in circulation," unquote, page 224, etc. Since Lassalle here speaks vaguely of moderne Entdeckungen auf diesem Gebiet, editor's note, modern discoveries in this field, end of editor's note, the theory of value and money, it can be assumed that he has precisely in mind conversations with Marx and letters from him. On pages 225 to 228, Lassalle reproduces a long passage from Plutarch, proving further, convincingly, that it is indeed Heraclitus who is referred to, and that Plutarch here expounds, quote, "the basic features of the speculative theology of Heraclitus," unquote, page 228. The passage is a good one. It conveys the spirit of Greek philosophy, the naivete, profundity, the flowing transitions. Lassalle reads into Heraclitus even a whole system of theology and quote-unquote objective logic, in parentheses, sic, ! etc. In short, Hegel, apropos of Heraclitus. An infinite number of times, truly wearisomely, Lassalle emphasizes and rehashes the idea that Heraclitus not only recognizes motion in everything, that his principle is motion or becoming, Werden, but that the whole point lies in understanding, quote, "the processing identity of absolute, in parentheses, schlechten, opposites," unquote, in parentheses, page 289 and many others. Lassalle, so to speak, hammers into the reader's head the Hegelian thought that in abstract concepts and in the system of them the principle of motion cannot be expressed otherwise than as the principle of the identity of opposites. Motion and Werden, generally speaking, can be without repetition, without return to the point of departure, and then such motion would not be an quote-unquote identity of opposites. But astronomical and mechanical, in parentheses terrestrial, motion, and the life of plants, animals, and man, all this has hammered into the heads of mankind not merely the idea of motion, but motion precisely with a return to the point of departure, that is, dialectical motion. This is naively and delightfully expressed in the famous formula or aphorism of Heraclitus. Quote, "It is impossible to bathe twice in the same river." Unquote. Actually, however, as had already been said by Cratylus, a disciple of Heraclitus, it cannot be done even once, for before the whole body has entered the water, the latter is already not the same as before. Nota bene, this Cratylus reduced Heraclitus's dialectics to sophistry, pages 294 to 295, and many others, by saying, "Nothing is true, nothing can be said about anything," a negative and merely negative conclusion from dialectics. Heraclitus, on the other hand, had the principle, quote, "Everything is true," unquote. There is a part of truth in everything. Cratylus merely wagged his finger in answer to everything, thereby showing that everything moves, that nothing can be said of anything. Lassalle in this work has no sense of moderation, absolutely drowning Heraclitus in Hegel. It is a pity. Heraclitus in moderation, as one of the founders of dialectics, would be extremely useful. The 850 pages of Lassalle should be compressed into 85 pages of quintessence and translated into Russian. Heraclitus as one of the founders of dialectics according to Lassalle. Something useful could result. The basic law of the world according to Heraclitus, logos, sometimes necessity, is, quote, "the law of transformation into the opposite," unquote. Page 327. In parentheses, equals necessity, necessity. Lassalle expounded the meaning of necessity as the quote-unquote law of development. Page 333, quoting inter alia the words of Nemesius, quote, "Democritus, Heraclitus, and Epicurus assume that neither for the universal nor for the particular does foresight exist," unquote. Ibidem. And the words of Heraclitus, quote, "The world was created by none of the gods or men, but is eternally a living fire, and will always be so," unquote. Ibidem. It is strange that, in rehashing the religious philosophy of Heraclitus, Lassalle does not once quote or mention Feuerbach. What was Lassalle's attitude in general to Feuerbach? That of an idealist Hegelian? Hence, Philo said of Heraclitus's doctrine, quote, that it, in parentheses, die Lehre, editor's note, the doctrine, end of editor's note, like that of the Stoics, derives everything from the world, and brings it into the world, but does not believe that anything came from God, unquote. 334. An example of touching up as Hegelian. Lassalle translates the famous passage of Heraclitus, according to Stobaeus, on quote-unquote das eine Weise, editor's note, the one wise, end of editor's note, as follows, quote, "However many discoveries I have heard, no one has succeeded in recognizing that the wise is that which is separated from all, that is, from all that exists," unquote. 344. Considering that the words beast or God are an insertion, and rejecting the translations of Ritter, quote, "Wisdom is remote from all," unquote, 344, and Schleiermacher, quote, "The wise is separated from all," unquote, in the sense of quote-unquote cognition, distinct from the knowledge of particulars. According to Lassalle, the meaning of this passage is as follows, that, quote, "the absolute, the wise, is alien to all sensuous determinate being, that it is the negative," unquote. 349. That is, negative equals the principle of negation, the principle of motion, a clear misrepresentation as Hegelian, reading Hegel into Heraclitus. A mass of details on the external connection between Heraclitus and Persian theology, Ormazd, Ahriman, and the theory of magic, etc., etc., etc. Footnote. Ahriman, the Greek name for the Persian god, personifying the source of evil, an eternal and irreconcilable enemy of his brother Ormazd, the good spirit. End of footnote. Heraclitus said, quote, "Time is a body," unquote. Page 358. This, Lassalle says, is in the sense of the unity of being and nothing. Time is the pure unity of being and not being, etc. Fire, for Heraclitus, it is said, equals the principle of motion, and not simply fire. Something similar is fire in the teaching of Persian philosophy and religion. 362. If Heraclitus was the first to use the term logos, word, in the objective sense, law, this too is said to be taken from the Persian religion. 364. A quotation from the Zenavesta. 367. Footnote. Zenavesta, the designation for the ancient Persian religious books expounding the Zoroastrian religion, founded according to legend by the prophet Zarathustra, Zoroaster. End of footnote. In section 17 on the relation between justice and necessity, Lassalle interprets these ideas of Heraclitus in the sense of quote-unquote necessity, quote-unquote connection. 376. Nota bene, quote, the bond of all things, unquote. Page 379. Plato, in the Theaetetus, is alleged to express the Heraclitean philosophy when he says, quote, necessity binds together the essentiality of being, unquote. Quote, Heraclitus is the source of the conception common among the Stoics that necessity, rerum omnium necessitas, editor's note, necessity of all things, end of editor's note, expresses bond and ligation, illigatio, unquote. 376. Cicero, quote, I, however, call fate what the Greeks call necessity, that is, the order and sequence of causes, when one cause linked with another produces the phenomenon out of itself, unquote. Page 377. Thousands of years have passed since the time when the idea was born of, quote, the connection of all things, unquote, quote, the chain of causes, unquote. A comparison of how these causes have been understood in the history of human thought would give an indisputably conclusive theory of knowledge. Volume 2. Speaking of quote-unquote fire, Lassalle proves, by repeating himself 1,000 times over, that this is a quote-unquote principle for Heraclitus. He insists especially on the idealism of Heraclitus. Page 25, that the principle of development, des Werdens, editor's note, of becoming, end of editor's note, in Heraclitus, is logisch preexistent, editor's note, logically pre-existent, end of editor's note, that his philosophy equals ideal philosophy, editor's note, idealistic philosophy, sic, exclamation point, page 25, squeezing into Hegelian. Heraclitus accepted, quote, pure and absolutely immaterial fire, unquote. Timaeus, on Heraclitus. On page 56, volume 2, Lassalle introduces a quotation from Clemens Al, editor's note, Clement of Alexandria, end of editor's note, Stromata 5, chapter 14, about Heraclitus, which, translated, literally reads, quote, the world, an entity out of everything, was created by none of the gods or men, but was, is, and will be, eternally living fire, regularly becoming ignited, and regularly becoming extinguished, unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. A very good exposition of the principles of dialectical materialism. But on page 58, Lassalle provides the following freie Übersetzung, editor's note, free translation, end of editor's note, of this passage. Quote, the world was, is, and will be continuous becoming, being constantly, but in varying measure, transformed from being into proceeding not being, and from the latter into proceeding being, unquote. An excellent example of how Lassalle verbalhorned Heraclitus, editor's note, corrects, in parentheses, ironic, end of editor's note, representing him as Hegelian, spoiling the liveliness, freshness, naivete, and historical integrity of Heraclitus by misrepresenting him as Hegelian, and in order to achieve this misrepresentation, Lassalle presents a rehash of Hegel for dozens of pages. This second section of the second part, Physics, pages 1 to 262, triple exclamation point, volume 2, is absolutely intolerable. A farthing's worth of Heraclitus, and a shilling's worth of rehash of Hegel and of misrepresentation. One can only leaf through the pages in order to say that it should not be read. From section 3, The Doctrine of Cognition, a quotation from Philo. Quote, "For the one is that which consists of two opposites, so that when cut in two, the opposites are revealed. Is not this the proposition which the Greeks, say their great and famous Heraclitus, placed at the head of his philosophy and gloried in as a new discovery?" Unquote. 265. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. And the following quotation also from Philo. Quote, "In the same way, too, the parts of the world are divided into two and mutually counterposed, the earth into mountains and plains, water into fresh and salt. In the same way, too, the atmosphere into winter and summer, and likewise spring and autumn." And this served Heraclitus as the material for his books on nature. Borrowing from our theologian the aphorism about opposites, he added to it innumerable and laboriously worked out examples. In parentheses, Beliga, unquote, page 267. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. According to Heraclitus, the criterion of truth is not the consensus omnium, not the agreement of all. Page 285. In that case, he would be a subjectiva empirica. Editor's note, subjective empiricist. End of editor's note. Page 284. No, he is an objectiva idealist. Editor's note, objective idealist. End of editor's note. 285. For him, the criterion of truth, independent of the subjective opinion of all men, is agreement with the ideal law of the identity of being and not being. 285. See Marx 1845 in his thesis on Feuerbach. Lassalle is here reactionary. Footnote. Lenin is referring to Theses on Feuerbach by Marx, written in 1845. See Marx and Engels, Selected Works, Volume 2, Moscow, 1958, pages 403 to 405. End of footnote. Here it is clearly seen that Lassalle is a Hegelian of the old type, an idealist. On page 337, quoting inter alia, Buchner, note 1, Lassalle says that Heraclitus expressed a priori, quote, the very same thought, unquote, as, quote-unquote, modern physiology, quote, thought is a movement of matter, unquote. An obvious exaggeration. In the quotations about Heraclitus, it is merely said that the soul is also a process of transformation. That which moves is known by that which moves. A quotation from Chalcidius in Timachus, quote, Heraclitus, however, links our reason with the divine reason that guides and rules the world, and says that, on account of inseparable accompaniment, it too possesses knowledge of the governing decree of reason, and when the mind rests from the activity of the senses, it predicts the future. Unquote. Page 342. From Clemens, Stromata 5, quote, owing to its incredibility, it, namely the truth, escapes from becoming cognized. Unquote. 347. Heraclitus, Lassalle says, is, quote, the father of objective logic, unquote. Page 351. For in him, quote-unquote, natural philosophy, Umschlägt, editor's note, is transformed, end of editor's note, into the philosophy of thought. Quote, thought is recognized as the principle of existence, unquote. 350, etc., etc., a la Hegel. The moment of subjectivity is said to be lacking in Heraclitus. Section 36, Plato's Cratylus, pages 373 to 396. Footnote: Cratylus, Plato's dialogue, directed against the sophists. End of footnote. In the section on Cratylus, Lassalle proves that in this dialogue of Plato's, Cratylus is represented not yet as a sophist and subjectivist as he subsequently became, but as a true disciple of Heraclitus, who really expounded his, Heraclitus's, theory of the essence and origin of words and language as an imitation of nature, quote, imitation of the essence of things, unquote, page 388. The essence of things, quote, the imitation and copy of God, unquote, quote, imitation of God and the universe, unquote, ibidem. Ergo, history of philosophy. These are the fields of knowledge from which the theory of knowledge and dialectics should be built. The separate sciences, the mental development of the child, the mental development of animals, language, nota bene, plus psychology, plus physiology of the sense organs. Kurz, editor's note, briefly, end of editor's note, the history of cognition in general, the whole field of knowledge. Greek philosophy indicated all these moments. Quote, we have shown, says Lassalle, that the above-mentioned, quote, conceptual identity, precisely identity, and not merely analogy between word, name, and law, is in every respect a principled view of the Heraclitean philosophy and of fundamental importance and significance in it, unquote. 393. Quote, names are for him, in parentheses Heraclitus, laws of being. They are for him the common element of things, just as for him laws are the common element of all, unquote. 394. In the margin of the following sentence, Lenin has written, very important. And it is precisely Heraclitean ideas that Hippocrates expresses when he says, quote, names are the laws of nature, unquote. Quote, for both laws and names are for the Ephesian equally merely products and realizations of the universal. Both are for him the achieved, purely universal ideal being, freed from the stain of sensuous reality, unquote. 394. Plato analyzes and refutes the philosophy of Heraclitus in his Cratylus and Theaetetus, and in so doing, especially in the latter, he confuses Heraclitus, the objective idealist and dialectician, with the subjective idealist and sophist, Protagoras. In parentheses, man is the measure of all things. And Lassalle proves that in the development of ideas, there has actually stemmed from Heraclitus 1. Sophistry, in parentheses Protagoras, and 2. Platonism, the quote-unquote ideas, in parentheses objective idealism. One gets the impression that Lassalle, the idealist, left in the shade the materialism or materialistic tendencies of Heraclitus, misrepresenting him as Hegelian. Chapter 4, Ethic, pages 427 to 462. In the section on ethics, nil, on pages 458 to 459, Lassalle writes that Nemesius said that Heraclitus and Democritus denied pre-vision, whereas Cicero, in parentheses de fato, said that Heraclitus, as also Democritus and others, including Aristotle, recognized fatum, necessity. And next to the following quote in the margin, Lenin has written, Natur not vendicait, in Lassalle. Editor's note, natural necessity, end of editor's note. Quote, this fatum is intended to signify only the immanent natural necessity belonging to the object, its natural law, unquote. 459. The Stoics, according to Lassalle, took everything from Heraclitus, making him banal and one-sided. Page 461. The index to Lassalle's book is compiled in a learned, pedantic manner, but senselessly, a heap of names of the ancients, etc., etc. In general, summa summarum, Marx's judgment is correct. Lassalle's book is not worth reading.